I've been working through the Gospel of Mark for the last several weeks. And if you've not been with us, you want to know we're moving through. We started first Sunday in January, and we're hoping to be done by Easter Sunday. Will be the last week. We'll be in Mark chapter 16 on that week, and we'll talk about the resurrection together. But we've been walking through the story, and the story of Jesus is up and down. We find Jesus with crowds and doing miracles and healing people. And then on the other hand, we find the religious leaders criticizing Jesus, questioning him, even his own family, as we talked about last week. They don't believe who he is, and so we have dealt with that. So we see kind of the high and the lows of Jesus' ministry. Now, the section that we're going to be in today, there's more ebb and flow. And so in many ways, this section kind of is really typical of Mark, going from the good and the bad, the tough times, the joyous times. And so we're going to be there this morning. And one thing you'll want to know is that Jesus' popularity has grown, very popular. He can't even go into a town without people coming out of the woodwork to find him and then bringing sick to him. And so you're going to feel this morning as we're walking through this text, Jesus' life at this point is very busy, very hectic, and at the same time, he is on mission from God doing all that he is doing. So let me invite you to turn in Mark chapter 6. We're going to be looking at verse 7. That's where our text starts this morning. But before we do that, let's look back at verse 6 and kind of figure out where we left off last week and then think about where we go from there. But we read last week that he was amazed at their lack of faith. Who's he talking about here? These are the people in his hometown. Then Jesus went around teaching from village to village. So he's going around from town to town, village to village. And now he's going to involve his disciples in a more significant way. So far they've been walking around with Jesus. I mean, can you imagine walking around with Jesus and just seeing all that you would see? People being healed. And so far, they've kind of had their hands in their pockets, just being bystanders. But Jesus is going to change that here in verse 7. Look at what he says here. Calling the 12 to him, he began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over impure spirits. Okay, guys, we're going to go on a mission trip, okay? In fact, you're going to go 2 by 2. I'm going to send you out, and I'm going to give you authority. Same authority, Jesus says, that I've had to cast out evil spirits, the same authority to heal. You're going to have that. Now you're going to go out 2 by 2. But here is the instructions that he gives them. Look at verse 8. These were his instructions. Take nothing for the journey except a staff. No bread, no bag, no money in your belts. Wear sandals, but not an extra shirt. Whenever you enter a house, stay there until you leave that town, and if any place will not welcome you or listen to you, leave that place and shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them. Now, I don't know about you, but if I were heading out on a trip like this, I think I'd want to have more than Jesus is allowing me to take, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you be scratching your head? Jesus, why are you letting me take a staff, but you're telling me I can't pack bread or a bag or money? I mean, won't I need those things as I go along? You might be asking. Jesus says they can take sandals. He's not going to send them out barefooted, but they can't take an extra change of clothes. In other words, Jesus wants them to be fully dependent on God and fully dependent on the hospitality of others. And then he gives them instructions here. He says, when people offer you hospitality, I want you to accept it. I want you to stay there in that place as long as people are hospitable to you. Now, what you want to know about this day and time, it was a little bit different than today. Now, today, if you're going to take a trip somewhere, you're probably going to call ahead and you're going to reserve a hotel room. That's just what you do. But in this day and time, there were no hotel rooms. There were places that people would stay, but most of the time it was out of hospitality. You would go into a town, and people would welcome you and receive you. In fact, it was an insult if you did not show hospitality to the traveler as they came into your midst. But some people will accept them, Jesus says, but he also lets them know that there will be times that they'll be rejected. Look at verse 12. They went out and preached. He wants them to know that they'll be rejected. And if they are rejected, they are to leave that place. Jesus says, shake the dust off from your feet. And then look at verse 12. They went out and preached that people should repent. Now, that's the same message that Jesus had been preaching, the same message that John the Baptist had been preaching, right? That's what they're to do. They drove out many demons and anointed many sick people with oil and healed them. So they're having success on their trip. They're preaching, they're proclaiming, they're encountering demons the same way that Jesus did. They're encountering sick people, and they're doing what Jesus told them to do. And power is in what they are doing. They have authority. I mean, that had to be quite the experience, don't you think, as these disciples were doing this on their own. Now, pretend with me for a minute that you're watching a movie, okay? Because as you're reading, in Mark's day, as Mark was writing this would be the primary vehicle that you would communicate. Maybe today a gospel writer would create a movie to show us what happened, right? Because that's how we think in today's terms. So picture with me a movie. And so you've got these disciples. They go out. They do this incredible work. And then the scene fades. And we read here that we read here the story of John the Baptist. Look at verse 16. But when Herod heard this, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised from the dead. So, again, scene fades away from the disciples. Scene fades in on Herod. And Herod is thinking that Jesus is John the Baptist raised from the dead. Now, if you're reading Mark, you might know so far that Mark has told us that John has been put into prison, but we don't have any backstory on John. Well, here's the backstory. So, the scene then fades back to the place where John the Baptist is killed. Now, I won't read that entire story this morning just because I don't want to keep you here all day, but I want you to maybe go home and read that story. It's in verses 17 through 29. And again, it's kind of like the movie that says, just prior to this happened, and then you kind of go back in time and you see what happened before. And let me just give you a teaser here. The story includes a king marrying his brother's wife, a dancing young girl, and a head on a platter, okay? So let me tell you, anybody who says the Bible is boring is just wrong, okay? So just read there in verses 17 through 29. You get the backstory of what happened to John the Baptist. But he's dead. He's off the scene now. And then the scene fades back in verse 30 to Jesus' disciples returning from their trip. So that's kind of how Mark is writing here. Verse 30 says, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. I bet it was like, kids coming back from a trip, right, or a retreat. They're just talking. They can't hush about it because it's so exciting, all the things that happened. You wouldn't believe what happened to me over here. You wouldn't believe what happened in this town. Let me tell you what happened to him. I mean, you would hear the story after story. And so that's what's going on here. I bet there was lots of laughter, lots of smiles as they gathered with Jesus, sharing their stories. Jesus has sent them out, and they've had success. But at the same time, you got to remember, Jesus is preparing his disciples for when he's going to leave, but he's not ready to leave quite yet. So Jesus and his disciples are still traveling around from town to town. Jesus is worn out. I mean, every time they go into a town, people are everywhere. You can imagine Jesus is pretty much exhausted. And then what would we read in verse 31 there? Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. How many of you have been so busy that you just forgot about lunch? You ever had that experience? It's maybe 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and all of a sudden you think, oh, I'm kind of hungry now. I didn't even eat lunch. I've just been moving so fast. That's what's going on with Jesus and his disciples. They haven't even had time to eat. They're so busy healing, so busy preaching, so busy going from town to town. And they decide that, hey, it's time for some rest. It's time that we get away. And then look what it says in verse 32. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. I think that's what I would do if I was Jesus. I would get away and just spend some time with the disciples. And you got to think, they've been out 2 by 2. They've been healing. They've been doing some incredible things. And Jesus probably just wants some time with them to unpack that, right? To debrief, to talk about all that's been going on there. And then look what happens in verse 33. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. So Jesus is getting in the boat on a lake. He's going to go across the lake. The people are, hey, that's Jesus. That's the disciples getting in that boat right there. And they run around the lake by foot. And by the time Jesus lands on the other side of a lake, there's all these people there who are waiting and wanting more from him. Look at verse 34. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, now just pause there a minute. If I'm Jesus, I think I'm going to say, hey everyone, we're on a retreat right now, and we'll be back in about 2 or 3 days, and if you'll just meet us here then, I'll take care of it then, right? Wouldn't that would be what you do? Jesus is worn out, but look at what it says here. He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. I'm getting tired just thinking about all that Jesus is doing here. He's traveling all over the place. At the same time, he's dealing with the criticism of the religious leaders. He's got this small group of disciples that he's trying to equip and train, and he's explaining things to them. He's sending them out 2 by 2 and letting them come back, and he's debriefing with them about all of that. And all the while, these large crowds are showing up, and they all have their things that they want healed. They want to be taught. All of this is going on here. And Jesus needs a break, doesn't he? But he doesn't send them home. He has compassion on them. He describes the people as sheep without a shepherd. Now, I don't know a whole lot about being a shepherd, but I know that sheep tend to just wander off, don't they? They tend to just kind of go. They just tend to do whatever they're going to do, and they need a shepherd to guide them. And Jesus sees these people as sheep without a shepherd. And so he pours out himself for them. He continues to have compassion on them. He's tired, he's worn out, but it's a beautiful picture of Jesus showing compassion and love and deep care for the people. Now, if you're looking in your Bibles here, you might have a Bible that has headings, the NIV headings, and you might know where this is going here. But let me encourage you, don't pay too much attention to the headings, because what I want you to do is I want you to follow the story as Mark is telling the story. And then we read in verse 36, by this time it was late in the day. So the disciples came to him. This is a remote place, they said. It's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. Now, in that day and time, you didn't have 24-hour McDonald's, did you? You couldn't just drive through and pick up a hamburger. Once the shops closed, the shops were closed. And the people are all out there. In a minute, we're going to see there's a lot of people out here, okay? And they're all out there, and there's no food, no catering service. There's no way for them to eat. And look at what they say. Jesus, it's time to close it down for the day. Let's send them into the villages. They can buy some food. They can prepare their own meals. They can eat, and we can do this again tomorrow. But look at what Jesus says to them. Jesus says in verse 37, but he answered, you give them something to eat. And can you imagine the disciple, who, us? I don't know about it. Jesus, I didn't bring a food truck, okay? We don't have a catering service. I don't know how we're supposed to give them something to eat. And look at their response in verse 37. They said to him, that would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? I mean, Jesus, we could go into town, we could buy some food, but let me tell you, that would be a lot of food, a lot of money. Again, we're going to find out that there are thousands of people here. It would cost a lot of money, Jesus. And you see embedded in that question there, are we to go and spend that much on bread that they're just going to eat and it's going to be gone, right? Whenever you eat, it's just consumed, isn't it? And half a year's wages? I mean, embedded in the disciples' comments here are doubt and disbelief and distrust. Jesus, are you sure you know what you're doing here? I mean, look what Jesus says in verse 38. How many loaves do you have? He asked, go and see. When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Go take inventory, guys. Okay, but not going to be a lot of food. They come back. Just what we thought, only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Again, thousands of people. It's really not going to work, Jesus. Can't we just send them home now? Verse 39, then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. Now, you got to think they're wondering, okay, groups, you want us to put them in groups? Okay, we'll put them in groups, Jesus. Nobody has the nerve to ask Jesus at this point. You notice that? Nobody questions him. They just do what they're supposed to do. So they sat down in groups of how many? Hundreds and fifties. We're not talking about, just a few people here. We're talking about a mass group of people. And then verse 41, taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. Are you with me here? 5 loaves, 2 fish. Not a lot of food. Pass it out, guys. Verse 42. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. Just in case you don't get it here or you miss it here, this is a miracle. In a few minutes, we're going to realize the disciples didn't even know it. They didn't realize it at first. They didn't even realize that it's a miracle. Look at what verse 44 tells us. The number of the men who had eaten was 5,000. Now, in those days, you didn't count women and children, and some scholars tell us there may have been as many as 10 to 15,000 people there that day, and Jesus fed them all with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Now, again, we're going to read in a few minutes, the disciples didn't really even get it. They didn't really even understand. And I think it's interesting here that Mark doesn't give us any dialogue here. Doesn't tell us what Jesus says, what the disciples are saying. That nobody's going, holy cow, what happened? You don't even see that they were amazed here at this point. The story just keeps going here. And look at verse 45. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. I mean, not a lot of, whoa, what just happened? Not a lot of that. Just immediately, all right, guys, head on out. I'll meet you later. And the disciples get in a boat. And what does it say here? After leaving them, verse 46, he, Jesus, went up on a mountainside to pray. So just kind of matter of factly, Mark tells us, disciples get in a boat, leave. Jesus goes to a mountainside to pray. And then look at verse 47. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on the land. So we have Jesus out in the disciples out in the lake, and we know that Jesus was already out on the lake at one point, calmed the storm. We remember that whole deal. So the lake was not necessarily a good place to be, especially when you got the guy who can't calm storms. He's up on the mountain somewhere. So they're out there on the lake, and look what it says in verse 48. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them walking on the lake. Now, you're reading Mark here, okay? And you're just reading this along. You haven't been at Sunday school. You've never heard this story before, right? And you're reading this, and you're going, wait a minute here. He's on a mountain. They're on the lake. They're struggling. They're trying to row. They're facing the wind. They're having a hard time. And it just simply says, shortly before dawn, he went out to them walking on the lake. Did you get it? He's walking on the lake. Verse 48, he was about to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. No doubt. I mean, people don't walk on lakes, right? And they see him out there, and they think, what is that? Verse 48, they cried out because they saw him and were terrified. Now, I'd be terrified too. Jesus is walking on water, and they've got to be thinking, is it Jesus? Is it a ghost? What's going on here? Immediately he spoke to them and said, take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. Now, what is it? Jesus just walking around out there? Is he just out for a stroll in the middle of the night? I mean, it's almost like he's just going to keep walking by them, doesn't it? Until he sees them and they see him. And then look at what it says in verse 51. Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed. Now that's what you think you should read about the feeding of the 5,000, but you don't. But now they see him walking on the water, and they're astounded. And he climbs into the boat with them, and the winds just stop. Again, these winds that maybe for hours they've been rowing into and couldn't make any progress. They couldn't get across the lake. And all of a sudden, Jesus is walking. He's out there, and now he steps in the boat, and the winds are just calm. And then look at what it says in verse 52. For they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hard. Mark gives us a clue here that they didn't really get it when Jesus fed the 5,000. And now they saw him doing another miracle, walking on water, and now they're going, holy cow, what is all this about? Mark wants us to get that they don't get it. They don't understand what's going on. They don't fully understand who Jesus is, what he's come to do. He keeps blowing their minds with these things that he's doing. He's walking on water. He's feeding 5,000. And they begin to have this conversation with Jesus. Now, before we get to that conversation, I want to mention this. It's important that Jesus is doing the types of miracles that he's doing. And as you look back at the Old Testament and you see who God is and what God has come to do, the Old Testament often talks about God as having authority over the water, authority over the sea, over rivers, storm, wind. And so all of the miracles that Jesus is doing, Jesus is in essence saying, I'm God. And so he's not just doing these miracles haphazardly. He's doing them all on purpose, and he's showing us that he has power over all of creation, over food, over wind, over sea. He provides what people need. He's ultimately going to provide by dying on the cross for their sins. But he's not there yet. He's heading that way. But here, he exercises authority over the forces of nature. Why? Because he's God. And that's what he wants them to understand. Now, again, you got to remember, who are the first people reading Mark's gospel? We talked about this the first week. The first people who are reading Mark's gospel are Christians who are living in Rome somewhere around the year 60 to 70 AD, and the Emperor Nero is killing them. They're being persecuted. And you can imagine, if you're being persecuted, you'd want to know that Jesus is in charge of all things. You want to know that Jesus has authority over the forces that seem to be ruling the day. And so that's what Mark is writing to them. Now let's keep going in the text. They're out in this boat with Jesus, and then they're having this conversation with him that they don't get it, and then they're right back at it again in verse 53. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. I mean, here it is again. Again, I'm getting worn out just thinking about this. They go from one place to another, and they get there, and all these people are there. You can just imagine, people on mats, and people who are blind, and people who have diseases. They're all coming to Jesus for healing. They ran throughout the whole region, verse 55, and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages, towns, or countrysides, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak. And all who touched it were healed. Crowds, busy people coming from everywhere to be healed. We're getting these pictures, these glimpses of Jesus. You see all the different aspects here? Religious leaders who are turning their nose up at Jesus. The people from his hometown that don't really get who he is. The disciples who, they're in this thing, but they don't quite get it either. The crowds, and all they want is for their friends to be healed. And here's Jesus walking around, God in the flesh, letting himself be made known. Now, again, if you're following along in your Bibles, we're getting this ebb and flow here. We're beginning to see Mark's given us these different pictures. And all of a sudden, it turns back to the religious leaders here. Chapter 7 here, we won't read all of this today, but in the first section of chapter 7, it's described here the religious leaders are criticizing Jesus once again, this time over the issue of cleanliness. And again, I know we're kind of moving fast here, but stick with me in this story here. Jesus and his disciples would eat, and they would not go through all of the religious rituals that the religious people, the Pharisees, went through. Now, again, when you read this at first, you might think, well, are they not washing their hands? Are they just, they need to wash their hands before they eat, you might be thinking. But he's not talking about washing in a sense of just physically washing your hands before you eat. There was this whole set of rituals that they went through before every meal, and Jesus and his disciples didn't go through that. And the religious leaders are criticizing him. Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing this ritual? Why aren't you going through this? And Jesus responds to them by quoting Isaiah. Look at what he says. This is Isaiah 23:13. It's what Jesus quotes in chapter 7. He says, "These people came near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship of me is based merely on human rules that they have been taught." And then look at what Jesus says in chapter 7, verse 8. "You've let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human tradition." This is the point Jesus is making here. You're just following all the religious rules of the day, but your heart is not in the right place. See, Jesus has come to set the record straight. He's not going around teaching people how to go through the religious practices of eating a meal. Jesus is just giving them bread when there's no bread, right? Jesus is making something out of nothing. He's walking on water. He's healing people. He cares more about people and less about the religious exercises of his day. And so we have 3 miracles here in chapter 7. And in these miracles, Jesus is extending his grace to Gentiles. And in verses 9 through 23, we won't read every verse here because it'll just take too long to go through it. But if you're looking at your Bibles, verses 9 through 23, Jesus blasts the religious leaders. Jesus speaks of what it means to please God. And it's nothing like the religious leaders thought. I think this section is worth reading here. In verses 9 through 13, Jesus gives examples of how the religious leaders are encouraging people to give money to the temple, but he's not. The religious leaders are not telling people to take care of their parents, and Jesus calls them out on that. You're following this rule over here, but you're not following this rule over here. You're picking and choosing the laws that serve you best. That's what he's saying to the religious leaders here. And then look at what he says in verse 14 here. Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them." Again, what's he doing? He's talking about this religious ritual that he's being criticized for not doing. And Jesus says, look, it's not about getting all these rituals right so that what goes in me is clean. It's about what's going on in my heart. And then look at what he says. He went on. What comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All of these evils come from inside and defile a person. Now, I don't know that this is the case. It may not have been, but I envision Jesus here looking into the eyes of the religious leaders as he says these things. And he knows their sins. And I picture him looking and saying sexual immorality, and his eyes meets with somebody who is dealing with that, and theft and murder and adultery and malice. And every time he names a sin, I just picture him looking into the eyes of somebody, some religious leader who's dealing with that sin, and he knows their hearts. And all they're worried about is going through the motions, doing all the religious stuff. You see, Jesus has come to turn things upside down. Jesus has come to show that he's got power over the wind, over the sea, over food, over provision. And all they can worry about is everybody going through all of the right things before they eat. That's all they're worried about. And Jesus shows up and says, I've got authority over the religion of the day. The religious leaders think they have it all figured out, but they don't. They're all hypocrites. And Jesus moves in and begins to shake up their world. As we keep going in the story here, we find Jesus moving into a Gentile region here and then offering grace. Look what it says in verse 24. Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. And again, we won't have time to detail all of the miracles here, but just to give you an overview here, Jesus cast an evil spirit out of a young girl in verses 24 through 30. He heals a deaf and mute man in verses 31 through 35. And notice what Jesus says to people in that place. Look at verse 36. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone. But the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. You know, people will talk about what they want to talk about, right? And if something incredible is happening, people are going to share it. And that's what's going on here. Verse 11 of chapter 8. Or go on to chapter 8 here. Another mass feeding. We won't have time to cover that mass feeding, but we do see 2 different times where Jesus feeds a crowd. The feeding of the 5,000 and then the feeding of the 4,000. Then verse 11, the religious leaders show up. They began to question Jesus again. This is kind of the theme here. The Pharisees come and begin to question Jesus, to test him, and to ask him for a sign from heaven. Isn't that almost humorous, what we're reading here? Yeah, Jesus, we want you to prove to us that you're God. And here we've seen him do miracle after miracle after miracle. And they want proof. Jesus says, and look at verse 12. He sighed deeply. You guys just don't get it. That's what he's probably thinking. You just don't get it. Why does this generation, I'm in verse 12, ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given. In other words, if you can't see it by now, you're not going to see it. If you don't get it by now, you're not going to get it. And Jesus gets in a boat and he heads out. And this time, Jesus is in the boat with his disciples, and we get kind of a peek into this private conversation here between Jesus and his disciples. Again, Mark is recording this, but I think Mark is getting his information probably from Peter at this point. And he begins to tell us that the disciples forgot to bring bread. I think that's kind of funny after these two mass feedings. You know, they might have been like, hey, we don't need bread, right? We got Jesus with us. He can give us all the bread that we want. But notice it said here that they forgot to bring bread, except they did bring one loaf. But that's not enough for everybody. And then Jesus says in verse 15, be careful. Jesus warned them, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. He's probably still cooling down from this confrontation with the Pharisees. And we know Herod, he's a madman, right? He chopped John the Baptist's head off. And Jesus knows that ultimately the Pharisees and Herod are going to kill him. And so Jesus is talking to them about that. And then we get this peek into a conversation. Look at Mark 8, verse 16. They discussed this with one another and said, is it because we have no bread? I mean, they're like, maybe Jesus is upset because we forgot the bread. That's kind of where they are. And then Jesus jumps in verse 18. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? You can almost just feel the frustration, can't you, in his voice here. Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? At this point in Mark's gospel, Jesus, it seems that he's frustrated with his disciples. He's been doing all of this. He's tired, but they don't seem to get it. And then look what it says in verse 18. Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. Yeah, do you remember that? How many did you start with? How many did we end with? How many people ate and were satisfied? They didn't get it. And then he says in verse 20, and when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?